Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, what comes after grief? Yes, my friend, we are talking about grief again. What can I say? This is a topic that interests me a lot. And while I think it's not a sexy topic, we still need to talk about it because it's important. I truly think if we want to live authentically, connected and whole from our authentic self, we need to feel all our feelings, the uncomfortable ones especially. In a culture of toxic positivity, we avoid talking about loss and grief at all cost. But loss and grief are part of life. If you ever loved, you know that loss is inevitable. Running away from it doesn't make it go away. Unexpressed grief from the past may be one of the most overlooked public crises of our time, says my guest, who is a strong voice and influential figure in the bereavement field, and her books have helped countless people, especially women, as she wrote about mother loss. And mother loss doesn't necessarily mean loss by death. There is abandonment, separation, neglect. Your mom could be alive, but you may live with mother loss. So don't think that loss and grief pertain to people who have lost people to death. This woman has been instrumental in my life, and I can say with certainty that her first book, Motherless Daughters, was life-changing. If you or someone you know needs help with mother loss, grief in general, she is an invaluable resource. I am speaking with Hope Edelman. She's been writing, speaking, and leading bereavement retreats and workshops in the bereavement field for more than 25 years. She was 17 when she lost her mother to breast cancer, an event that inspired her to write her book, Motherless Daughters, and to offer grief education and support to adults who have experienced early parent loss. Motherless Daughters was a #1 New York Times bestseller and has been published in 14 countries. Hope's most recent book, AfterGrief, offers a new language for discussing the long arc of loss. She's been published 6 additional books, including Motherless Mothers and the memoir, The Possibility of Everything. Hope has also published articles and essays in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Parade, Real Simple, and CNN.com. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and a master's degree in nonfiction writing from the University of Iowa. She is a certified Martha Beck life coach and has also done certificate training in narrative therapy. Her new book is one of the most important books I've encountered on the topic. It's called AfterGrief, Finding Your Way Along the Long Arc of Loss. As the title suggests, adjusting to loss is a lifelong process. But as you'll learn from this conversation, it doesn't have to be a lifelong struggle. The aftergrief is where we learn to live with the central paradox of bereavement, that a loss can recede in time and yet remain so exquisitely present. She's been on the podcast before in episode 307, How Mother Loss Shapes Who We Become, with another amazing woman, Dr. Judith Rabenor, the author of The Girl in the Red Boots, and guest in episode 290, The Complicated Mother-Daughter Relationship. I treasured this time with hope, and I hope you will find comfort, value, and hope in it. Please enjoy. Hope, welcome again the second time around. I am so delighted you're here today.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Yeah, you're one of my favorite authors, and I praise this book so much, The AfterGrief. I just love it. Every time I pick up, I read, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's masterful. She's exquisite. Your writing is just so powerful. So many quotables, tweetables, I guess, you can pull from this book. I think I would love to start from the title, The AfterGrief, which is a new word that you coined. And what I love about this book is that you give us lots of new terms and words to talk about grieving and loss. And let's start with the AfterGrief. What's an AfterGrief?
Well, my mom died in 1981. That's more than 40 years ago now. And when I was writing this book, I set out to write about what I call the long arc of loss, because I still think about her all the time. And I can still get really sad about what she lost or what I lost as a teenager, because I was 17 when she died. And now my dad has been gone for more than 15 years too. And I think about him a lot. But really, I was so young when my mother died, it was more of a defining loss. And so in writing about how grief continued to show up for me all these years later, and for other people that I've intersected with in the course of my work, because I've been doing this for almost 30 years, I realized we didn't have a word for what grief sort of shades into. And I think grief is a great term for what it's an apt term for what we experience and feel in the aftermath of a loss. But 20 years later, what we're feeling and experiencing is something very different. And there was no vocabulary to describe it or talk about it. And in the absence of language, I found that people didn't really know how to talk about it, and that they often would judge themselves or be judged by others for not being over it yet.
Yeah.
I remember one day I was driving down the road. I live in a canyon in Los Angeles, thinking, what's a word for what comes after grief? What is it that comes after grief? And by the time I got down to the bottom of the canyon, I think we'll just call it the AfterGrief. So that's the genesis of that term.
I love it. You also have other terms. We will get to that. But I was thinking, what a great name. Your first name is Hope, and you do this wonderful work. It's so great that you have this matching name with your work. And
it's a little on the nose, but yeah, my parents must have had some kind of prescience.
There are so many misconceptions about grief. And I think one of them is that grief it has that long arc that you're talking about. I was just listening to an interview today between two men, and the interviewee was telling that he lost his father, and the interviewer asked, what helped you to overcome your grief? As if we ever overcome and finish, right? There is like an end point. And he said, this book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of grief. And I think I hit all 5 stages, and I'm listening to myself. I'm like, no, you haven't. You need to read a different book. It doesn't work like that. And so in your book, you talk about that when your mom died, a social worker handed you a pamphlet too about the 5 stages of grief, right?
Right. It was in the hospital while my mother was dying. And I know she meant to be helpful, because this is how she'd been trained. And in 1981, this is how people thought about grief. They very much were learning about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. Her 5 stages were meant for people who were terminally ill, facing the ends of their lives. She never meant for it to be applied to mourners, but it got co-opted by the bereavement community or the popular culture. And so I looked at these 5 stages and I thought, okay, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And I've been through, I looked at it the day of my mother's funeral and thought, well, I've been through the first 4, so I guess I'm at acceptance. And a year later, when I graduated from high school and she wasn't there, and I was just sort of blindsided by grief, I thought I must have done it wrong, because the messaging was that this is how it's done. And now we know, and the bereavement community largely agrees that that was an ill-fitting model, and that grief is cyclical and acceptance is not an end point. I say in the AfterGrief, it's a way station. It's a place that we arrive at and then depart from and return to over and over and over again throughout the rest of our lives.
Yeah, so true, so true. And I think by you writing about this, you give us permission to experience, to talk, and you normalize our experience. Because I think when we hear that grief has an endpoint or there are stages, it sort of invalidates your inner experience. And you feel like, well, I don't know, I'm still feeling something. Maybe there's something wrong with me, or I'm not doing this right.
Right.
It's very comforting to know that there is no end point here, right? This is
Right.
going to be part of our story. The facts will never change, but we can make new meaning. As you say, wonderful. It is a wonderful quote in your book. I used it in my podcast intro the other day. Meaning is not something we stumble upon. We make it, or we have to make it. My father passed away last year. It's been almost a year. Here is what I want to ask you about. In the beginning, everybody is asking you, how are you doing? How are you feeling? But that window is very short. It hasn't even been a year, but I can tell you with honesty, no one has asked me, how am I feeling? How am I doing? Or how am I grieving? Or they think I'm over it. I'm done, right? Almost a year passed. I mean, she's doing great. She's working. She's podcasting. She's laughing. She's probably doing great.
Right.
And it's just so startling how lonely it can be.
Right. Well, we can be very high functioning and grieving at the same time, which is a surprise to a number of people who think that if we are grieving, their perception of grief is that we will be full of sorrow. We will not be able to adjust or adapt. We will be crying all the time. That's what most people think grief looks like, when in fact, what grief really looks like are periods of perfectly functional behavior punctuated by moments of deep sorrow. And so if they're not seeing those moments of deep sorrow, or those grief spikes, as we call them, when it bubbles up and threatens to overtake us, and they think that everything's fine. The window of opportunity for getting social support after a loss is, I'm going to say on average, about 3 weeks. And then everyone else has moved on, and we're left in a world thinking, wait, how can everyone be acting normal when nothing is normal anymore? And that's why, research has shown that people tend to have a dip in functioning at the 1 year point, and then another dip at the 2 year point. Because at the 1 year point, it's that feeling of, oh, I've made it through the year of first everything's without this person. And now my reward for that is I get to do it again and again and again. But the dip at this 2 year point is often when people realize, oh, like 2 years have passed. This is for real. This is forever. And after the 2 year point, people tend to be, on the upswing or a plateau. But I always tell clients, expect a little dip in functioning at the 1 year period. That's completely normal. And another dip at the 2 year period, but also expect to be revisiting and revising your story of your experience over time. You may discover new information about the loved one who died. You may look back at the same set of facts in a different way. You may have life events like becoming a parent, for example, where you accumulate experience and insight and look back at the loss and see it in a different way. That's completely normal. You're absolutely right, Anna, that what mourners find really comforting is validation and normalization. Robert Niemeyer, who's a very, very established and well-respected voice in the bereavement field, one of the biggest names in the bereavement field right now, has said that those who are grieving need three things in order to achieve, the optimal amount of healing for them at any point in time. It's social support, validation, and normalization, meaning that we need to grieve in community. We need to be reassured that our feelings are okay, that wherever we are is where we are meant to be. And normalization is knowing that other people feel the same way. I just finished leading a Motherless Daughters retreat last weekend. There were 12 women who came together. Some of them, their moms had died 50 years ago, but they really wanted to be in the company of other women who understood this long arc of loss. And we talked about in the room how so many of them had felt abnormal, had felt crazy, had felt weird because of the thoughts and feelings they had. And when they heard that everyone else in the room had similar thoughts and feelings, we thought everyone can't be weird and crazy in the same way. In this room, I'm normal, right? In this room, my behaviors are normalized. And it was such a relief, and the bonding that took place almost instantaneously was really almost miraculous to witness. But that happens every time. It's the 16th retreat I've done, happens every time.
Wow, that's just incredible. It's so interesting how people, like when I'm talking to my aunt and uncle, my uncle sometimes brings up the story how my dad passed and how he has his own guilt issues. And then my aunt comes in and she goes, don't talk about that. Don't upset the child. Like if we don't talk about this, everything will be fine. But the opposite is true. I do want to talk about this. And my aunt says to me, to this day, she says, when that bad thing happened to your dad, I'm like, listen, I'm almost 50. I can handle the word dying, death. We can call things by their names.
Right.
So say a little about how people don't want to, quote unquote, upset the grieving person by trying to distract and not address, which I find is really harmful, in fact.
Well, in some areas of life, if we don't think about a certain distress, we won't feel bad. Yeah. If we don't talk about it, we won't remember. And that doesn't really hold true for the death of a loved one who was really important to us. One of the central paradoxes of bereavement is that the larger culture or certain family members think if they don't talk about it, we won't be upset or they won't be upset. When in fact, talking about it is what helps us feel less upset. Remembering the person feels good. Not talking about them is more stressful than talking about them for most people. Not everyone. Of course, it depends on what your relationship with them was like. It depends on how they died. For some people, it is very, very stressful, and therapeutic help would be necessary for them to even be able to talk about it, especially in traumatic or violent loss. But for the majority of us, talking about our loved one feels good, and not being allowed or able to talk about them is what feels bad. I can't explain why it works that way, but there is a cultural message that if we don't talk about it, we won't be upset. It's also grief is very, very culturally relative. What's your family's background? What is the culture or the ethnicity or the religion?
Well, I'm Armenian, and it's a Christian country. And they have a lot of rituals and customs. Like you write about rituals and customs in your book. I do come from a very traditional, I would say, culture where, you grieve for, you do the burial. Then after that, there are ceremonies for the community and the friends and relatives. And there is I believe like the next day they gather again after the funeral. There is the 7th day, there is the 14th day, there is the 40th day. There's days throughout the year, and the first year anniversary, they do again a ceremonial thing, which I think is helpful, right? Collectively, you get together and you grieve, you go to the graveyard, you come, you eat, you talk. It's really powerful, but I'm here in America cut off from that. So it's been very difficult for me to participate in that. And it doesn't feel all right, because in the past, when my grandma, my other relatives have passed away, I was part of that. And I know how incredibly healing it is to just be amongst people who share that common thing.
Right. And to do it in community too. And if you're cut off from that community for any reason, you're left feeling kind of isolated with the grief and lonely in it, and doing the ritual by yourself or with a small group feels less meaningful, or maybe less comforting than doing it in the way that you're familiar with. The familiar and comforting rituals around bereavement are often disrupted by mobility, by deaths of other family members, by estrangements, by war, by displacement.
Mm. People wear black, like they almost, I think the wife, whoever lost the person, right? The firsthand people, right. The closest people wear black. They don't participate in weddings. They don't organize within a year family functions that are celebratory in my culture.
Okay.
For example, my cousin is getting married, but they are doing the wedding after the first anniversary of my father's passing. So there are a lot of strong traditions like that.
So your family maintains those rituals still?
They do maintain, not only my family, I think predominantly all of them. They maybe are not as strong as in the past, maybe, right? But I think they do preserve a lot of those ceremonies. Like when somebody passes, they cover the mirrors, right? I found that in Jewish tradition, it's the same as in Armenian.
That's true. But in Jewish tradition, which and my family is Jewish, it's just for 7 days. And we do have
it is for 7 days. They cover the mirrors. The mirrors they open later, right? But do the Jewish people wear black?
No, actually, not anymore. There's a black ribbon that you will pin to your clothing typically. But I do not believe that in my family, no. In my family, in fact, my grandmother was very superstitious. She did not believe in wearing black. She thought it was, and look at us, we're on Zoom right now, so we can see both of us are wearing black. How would you even know if people are in mourning in America today, since lots of us wear black, But what you're talking about reminds me of the Victorian mourning rituals of the 19th century, which were very, very elaborate. And they started disappearing in the first 20, 25 years of the 20th century, partly because of, interestingly enough, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19, because families lost so many members that it was hard. The mourning periods would have overlapped, but there used to be a certain kind of clothing that you would wear. You went from wearing black to wearing gray to wearing purple, I believe, if you were in high mourning or low mourning. The social engagements like you're describing were restricted and the time period that you were in mourning, what depended on how close you were to the person who died. So you would be in mourning, I believe it was 2 years for a spouse or child. It would be 1 year for someone who maybe you had what was considered a lesser relationship, like a parent or sibling, all the way down to 6 weeks for a brother or sister-in-law. And that gave structure and meaning and sort of like a collective purpose to grief. But, here in the US, we don't do that anymore. We have the funeral, we have the memorial or the celebration of life. And then unless you come from an ethnicity or a religion or a culture that has these rituals and your family participates in, you're kind of done. And you're expected to sort of just get back to work and move on. The average paid bereavement leave in the United States is 3 days.
Wow.
3 days. If you're of certain backgrounds, like if you're Jewish, that doesn't even get you through the mourning period. Then you have to start going into your paycheck or using your sick days or go back to work to keep your job. It's a real travesty. I mean, I think a minimum of 2 weeks should be on the books at every company, minimum.
So what do you think about wearing black or that ribbon? Don't you think that's kind of a good idea? It sort of signifies to the other person. It's a reminder in public. But I think in America, it wouldn't work because Armenia is a small country, a town is small where my father was. If my aunt is wearing black, everybody knows the family. So that makes sense. But in this kind of country, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, it's a signal to the public, hey, I'm in a tender place, treat me gently. I think that's a good thing. I think that could, that allows or invites people to treat us with compassion and gentleness, because otherwise, how would you know? Right? I mean, we don't often see somebody wearing that black ribbon, or we wouldn't see them in, high mourning dress from head to toe. And again, how would we know if someone's in mourning? Everyone wears black as a fashion statement. But I do feel like, there are going to be some people who don't want to advertise it, who don't want others to know. I remember I had someone gave me the black ribbon when my mother died. And I did wear it on the outside because I thought it was a show of respect for her. But the first day I wore it, a friend's grandmother said, "Why are you wearing that black ribbon? That's just for people who are in mourning." And then I had to explain that my mother died. And then I had to take care of how she felt upon hearing that. And so I just started wearing it underneath my clothes, like I pinned it to my bra strap and no one could see it. But now as an adult, I might want to have it on the outside just as a signal to anyone who knows what it means that I'm in a really, really tender place. So if you cut me off in your car and I look upset, don't shout at me. I'm having a bad year.
Yeah. Do males and females grieve differently? What have you discovered through your work or interviewing people?
Well, there's a masculine style of grief. There's a feminine style of grief. Of course, it's a generalization, but the research shows that about 85% of men grieve in a masculine style and 15% grieve in a feminine style, and the same for women. 85% grieve in the feminine style, 15 in the masculine style. The feminine style is what we tend to think grief looks like, which is wanting to talk about it, reaching out, having external displays of emotion, crying, longing, wailing. And that has done a terrible disservice to men who grieve in the masculine style and women who grieve in the masculine style, because it makes other people think that they're not upset, when in fact they grieve through action, typically, and through trying to honor the person who died. That is how the majority of men will grieve, will be to solve problems, to work through their grief, engaging in activity, grieving through doing. Let's say a man's father dies and they used to, do work around the house together all the time. Maybe after that man's father dies, he decides he's ready to renovate the garage, and he'll spend hours in there working on that. And that will be his way of feeling close to his dad. Now, his wife may not understand that because he's not talking about how he's feeling, and doesn't seem to be crying, but he is in fact grieving. There's a very moving passage in the AfterGrief, you might remember, where I interviewed a woman who had lost her child soon after birth and also had lost her brother. And she was a high school teacher. And a child in the high school had died in a car accident. And that girl's boyfriend would come to her classroom. She was the journalism professor. He would come to her classroom and she'd let him just stay in there. And he spent the first couple of days when he was back in school creating like a photo montage of this girl. And everyone at the school was thinking, what's wrong with him? He's not even grieving, and he was in the car. But in fact, she said she knew that he was working through his grief by memorializing her through choosing the photos and doing the design, the spread. I think it was a spread for the school paper. And so she said he was grieving. He just wasn't doing it in a way that other people recognized. And so that creates, conflict sometimes, certainly a disconnect between male-female partnerships. If they're grieving the same person and they're doing it so differently, they may not understand why or how the other one is grieving the way that they are, when they're both in fact grieving the loss of the same person.
Yeah, me and my husband both lost our fathers this year. So I see a lot of differences between us. So yeah, what I love about your work is another thing is, again, about language, is you say unexpressed grief as opposed to unresolved grief. A lot of people in literature, right? It was very common to see unresolved grief. I have used it myself. But when I became familiar with your work, I neglected that language because there is no resolution, right? And I remember taking a class, and in that class, it was a divorce mediation class. The teacher wrote on the blackboard with big letters, time plus closure equals healing, and that struck me at the time. I'm like, I don't know, but people really talk about time as this healing factor or this closure that we get. So I want to hear your thoughts about this word unresolved and unexpressed, and why do you think that? And is there really closure?
Two of the words that really irk me the most in this field are resolution and closure. You just hit on both of them in the same sentence. Right? When I'm working with a client, because I'm also a coach, when I'm working with a client who says my grief is unresolved, my first question is, what do you think resolution should look like? What does resolution look like to you in your mind? Everyone has a different answer, by the way. Mm-hmm. But there is
what do they say? Give me some examples.
When I think about my person, I won't feel sad anymore. I won't miss them. I will have more moments of happiness than of sadness, which is a reasonable goal to work toward. I will not, usually I won't cry anymore. I'll stop missing them. I will make peace with it. I will accept that they are gone. It's a lot of lingo from from popular culture. And then we talk about, well, although some people will say, I feel like it would mean that I'm not grieving anymore at all. This idea that I won't feel what I think grief is supposed to look like or feel like. And closure, I don't even know what that means. What does closure mean? I guess it means that we've created a story that feels emotionally and intellectually complete. And we can, stop running through the facts in our head, trying to figure out what the heck just happened and how we feel about it. Maybe that's what closure is. I think that's the closest thing to closure that I can imagine. But then that can all get ripped open again, like a big wound. And we have to start all over again if we get new information or have a new perspective or have a new experience that causes us to see the loss in a different way. And then then we will be working to come to a new plateau of closure. And I think that's kind of how it should be. We want to be in a constant state of evolution. And I think of the death of my mom, for example, as and feeling a sense of peace with it, or meaning or purpose as a result of it, as looking back on the same set of facts at different times in my life and having a different perspective and thinking about, like, the example that I give that I think articulates it the best is that the facts of my mother's death are never going to change. And she will always have died in 1981 of breast cancer when she was 42 and I was 17. But those facts have looked really different to me at different times in my life. When I was 17, they looked one way, which was, I'm almost all grown up. I don't really need a mom anymore. She was 42. She already, went to college and got married and had kids. She did all the big things in her life. That's what I thought at 17, because I was 17. And then when I became a mom at 33, I looked at those set of facts really differently. And I started thinking, God, it must have been so hard for my mom to leave 3 children behind. I was thinking more about her than me, and realizing, whoa, she was really, that must have been really scary and hard. And no wonder she didn't, want to accept the fact that she was dying. And when I was 17, I thought she didn't know she was dying because the information was kept from her, which in fact was true. But at 33, as a mom, I thought, well, maybe she kind of didn't want to know. And then when I turned 42, wow, did I look at her death differently, because I realized a 17-year-old's a baby. It's so young still. I had at that point, children who were 9 and 5, and I could see, I knew a bunch of 17-year-olds, and I thought, oh, they're still so young. But also I realized my mom only got to live half her life. 42 was a baby. A baby to me, it's a baby now. I'm 15 years past that age. And I think, my God, 42 is younger than most of my friends. 42 is almost young, it's definitely young enough to be my younger sister. Pretty soon it will be young enough to be theoretically, to be a daughter. And so I look back on those same set of facts very differently at different points in my life. That's part of the long arc of loss. And that's natural. And I kind of think maybe we should aspire to that, because we do want to change and grow and have new perspectives, don't we? I think.
Yeah. What I loved about in the later chapters of your book, you wrote, when you talk about storytelling, making meaning, you wrote your story, 2 different stories with 2 different perspectives and you gave the example in the book. I thought that was very powerful. But what I want to ask you about is, I really want to get this across in this podcast episode, because you created this terminology and it's very helpful for people. What is new grief, old grief? I think it's helpful for people to know, because when we feel these things, it's good to have a name for it.
Right. When you're driving down the road 20 years later and a song comes on the radio that you used to sing with your parent or play on the piano with your sibling, and you just have this intense surge of longing for that person. What does that mean? Where did that come from? And is that normal? What it means is you still love and miss that person. Where did it come from? It comes from, the storage of the memory of being with them and losing them. And is it normal? Yes. The answer is yes. Like 80 out of 80 people that I interviewed said that this happens to them. They can't all be outliers, right? I think then we have to say it's normal for this group of people. It's a normalized experience for this group of people. So new grief is what I believe we feel right after someone dies. It's very person specific. It's when we miss And then we're talking just about death because there's all kinds of grief, right? I'm talking a lot lately about divorce grief because I've been going through a divorce. There's the grief of losing a pet. There's the grief of having to move, losing a home, having to immigrate. All of these are forms of grief. But for our purposes, let's talk about loss by death. So new grief is what we feel right after someone dies. Again, it's very person specific. We're missing that person and painfully feeling their absence in our life. It's the sadness, it's the longing, it's the despair, it's the confusion, it's the anger. It's all of the emotions that come after someone dies. I think of that as new grief. Old grief is resurgences that it's like reactivated grief. You may feel that, I've adjusted to the world without this person. I've found my new normal. And then 5, 6, 10, 20 years later, you have a significant birthday or anniversary, and or you have what we call sneak attacks, where you see someone wearing a shirt that your father used to wear, or you catch a glimpse of someone who has the same hair color and haircut as your mom, and you feel, oh God, I miss that person so much. That's old grief. What I call new old grief is when we experience an old loss in a new way. And it's typically a one-time event, like a big life milestone. Becoming a parent will do it. Getting married can often do it. Graduations. It's when we miss the person in a way that we didn't or couldn't have missed them before that moment. These moments can't be pre-grieved. I never could have grieved the loss of my mother as a grandmother to my child until I had a child who didn't have a maternal grandmother present. So I had a big grief resurgence when my first daughter was born. It's also occurs around what we call age correspondence events, approaching, reaching, and passing the age a parent was when they were diagnosed or when they died. It's huge for this population. We don't talk about that much in this culture. Haven't been any way to ritualize it or even acknowledge it, except in communities of people who understand how profound it is to outlive a parent. But it's also fairly common if you're a parent, when your child reaches the age you were when your mom died or father died. When you look at that child and you remember being that age and what you went through and fearing that child might lose you, a lot goes on at that time. And then concern about not knowing how to parent a child beyond that age if you didn't receive mothering or fathering beyond that point. So that's new old grief. That's the distinction I make between the three. And I found it very helpful to think in those terms, and I hope readers do too.
I do too. I think it's useful to have language. Seriously, it's so important. You also talk about the 3 rings of grief, and there is a graphic. So I want to ask you about that too.
Sure. I went looking for a long-term model of bereavement, or a model for long-term bereavement, I should say. Any kind of graphic, any kind of representation that might explain how grief ebbs and flows over time. And I couldn't find one, so I created one myself. Because I think of grief as a process of expansion and contraction. We know it's not linear. It tends to be more cyclical. I've since seen a model that's a spiral, and that's useful. I talk about a couple different models in the book that I have come across. But I think of grief looking like a bullseye, kind of like the Target store logo, where there's a circle in the middle, and that's kind of the really acute phase, the new grief, the red hot center. And then over time, we sort of expand out into this middle ring, which is the ring of everyday living, where we're adjusting to a life without that person in it. But at any moment, we can get pulled back into the middle, like with one of those sneak attacks or an anniversary or an episode of new old grief. And then we go back out to the middle ring. So it's like movement between the middle ring and the center, the middle ring and the center. But then, typically after a while, not soon after a loss, sometimes, but typically over time, we can expand out into the third ring, which is the ring of growth. And that is where the theory of post-traumatic growth in psychology comes into play, where people start finding meaning and purpose in the tragedy or the trauma that they experienced. And and putting it into action in the world, making it actionable. And that can be in a small way, like being committed to being a better friend or a better parent, or it can be in a big way, like starting a foundation in the name of your loved one who died, or changing your career to help others and be of service. But even from that third ring, you can get pulled back into the middle. But I think, we're expanding and contracting. And that's the model that made the most sense to me now, 40 years after my mother has died.
Yeah. When you say people often, do charity work, open foundations, and I was speaking with someone for the podcast just the other day. I was asking him questions and he was dodging all my questions about his past and about his trauma. And all he talks about is what he's doing in the world because of this trauma and things like that. And I was wondering, is this too painful? Has he not processed? Has he processed and moved on? Is he in the larger growth ring? Or he has skipped? He doesn't even want to go into the middle or second part of this ring, because when you get busy, you can rob yourself off of this time to grieve, right? You need that time to grieve. I think I have felt that in my life too. Life can get so busy, but you do need to honor your feelings.
Well, sometimes people can focus on the post-traumatic growth as a means of not addressing their emotions. You're absolutely right about that. Now, we don't know what this man experiences when he's not talking to you. It may be that he's just not comfortable talking about his emotions, not feeling them, right? But I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Her first name is Candace. She has, we corresponded a bit, and she talked about this. She said that she threw herself right into starting a national organization. Candy Lightner, that's her name. It just came to me. Candy Lightner started Mothers Against Drunk Driving after her daughter died as the result of a drunk driver. And she became completely absorbed in this incredible organization that has saved so many lives. But she said she did it. Now she's very clear talking about how she did it as a means of not having to face her own grief. And at a certain point, she realized, no, I have to step back. And now I have to really attend to my grief. I thought the same thing after the Parkland shootings in Florida. Those kids kicked into gear so quickly and became advocates for gun control, which was inspiring to an entire nation. But I remember thinking, ooh, you know what? I don't know if they're getting time to deal with the trauma and the grief of so much loss and the fear that they all experienced. And over time, they started talking about how they now needed to do that, and that but they leapt right into, stepping into that ring of growth and trying to create meaning and purpose and be of service to others and prevent terrible things from happening again. But at the same time, it's really important to attend to our own grief so it doesn't get shelved for years, because we do know that, it will show up in us in other ways if we don't attend to our grief socially, mentally, physically, emotionally. It will show up in various different mental and physical disorders later in life, or it can. There's a likelihood that it will, whether that's, intense back pain or illnesses or depression or anxiety.
Or anxiety. Your colleague, your friend, Claire Bidwell Smith, right? I'm going to interview her for the podcast too, because I experienced severe anxiety after my father's death. And I never have had connected this to, have I not, read her book or come across her writing? It's so good that we speak about and normalize these experiences, because the listener can feel seen and heard and validated.
Absolutely. Claire's book, Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief, is such a game changer. I recommend it to anyone who's lost a loved one. Because what is anxiety? Anxiety is fear of the unknown. It's fear of the unknown future. And what else do we experience when someone dies? If we had a world of assumptions and hopes and dreams for the future that have now all been shattered, and we don't have anything to replace them with yet. Anxiety seems to me like a very appropriate response to that event, but it's not included in the quote stages of grief. So people feel like, well, I'm having a panic attack. How can that possibly be related to a death that occurred 6 or 12 months ago? And when in fact, yes, connecting those dots is very important. And if we can't do it ourselves, then finding trained professionals who can help us do it and walk us through the process.
Yeah, you mentioned there are different forms of loss and grief. I mean, during this pandemic, many of us experienced so many losses, and I am sure most of the people didn't even have time to grieve all those losses, right? Besides losing, people to COVID, they also lost their jobs and their freedoms. I don't know. I can speak from my experience what I lost, and these are pretty universal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
It's been an interesting social experiment to see what's happening. 2 years. It's been 2 years. We've been in this collective experience.
It has. We have crossed a bridge together. And even if what's on the other side resembles what we left behind, it's not going to be exactly the same ever again, because now we have the knowledge that it can all be taken away. Even if that's all that changes, that's pretty big. And, we know that things can change very, very quickly on a large scale. Yes, we lost a whole way of life for, very acutely for about the first 1.5 to 2 years. And even now, as it feels like a lot of what we gave up, a lot of those freedoms are coming back. Again, we're standing on the other side of that gorge with the knowledge that it's fragile, right? It's a very fragile balance, and it can be taken away at any moment. And of course, like you said, there are all the people who did lose loved ones to COVID as well.
Yeah.
I mean, 1 million people in the US, close to 1 million people, which creates, according to some estimates, about 9 million mourners. That's a significant number of people in our culture.
Yeah, who probably didn't have time to mourn, to grieve, because they have to make money, they have to tend to their kids, they have to go back to life, right? And that's why the numbers of anxiety and depression have risen so much.
And, and not being able to engage in the kinds of comforting or familiar rituals that we talked about at the beginning here.
The social aspect is huge.
Absolutely. To not be able to grieve in community, to not have those celebration of life events or the memorials, to not be able to do your religious rituals because no one's gathering in the church, or you can't have people over to your house.
Yeah. So what is your hope with this book? What do you want the reader to gain? What is your main message with this book?
Well, I do hope that it will normalize the experience of grief resurgences over time, and also that it will help give us, like you said, a vocabulary and a language for discussing what it's like for so many of us, to validate and normalize the experience and give us a language for talking about it, because in the absence of a language, there's often silence.
Yeah, and with that silence, there is the suffering.
Yes. Ooh, let's write that down.
Oh, thank you so much. I so appreciate your work. I really love your work. You're brilliant. Your writing is masterful. Like I said, exquisite. I can't wait to see what comes next. I am so moved and touched that you made time to come again to the podcast. It means a lot. And your work has truly been life-changing for me. And I can't recommend the AfterGrief enough. I think, especially now, right, with this COVID, everybody needs to everybody needs to be literate about loss and grief, period. In general, I think we need grief literacy, but especially now, many people may not even know that they're grieving. What they're feeling. There was an article, I think, by David Kessler.
In the Harvard Business Review, I think it was. That what we're all feeling now is grief.
Yeah, I think that went viral. And I think I like seeing this kind of writings because, like you said in the book, Unexpressed Grief from the Past may be one of the most overlooked public health crises of our time. And we all need to be literate in this subject. So thank you so much. It's not a sexy topic, but you have devoted your life to this and you're not tired, tirelessly, passionately. Your next book is always so amazing. I can't believe that the Motherless Daughters, you wrote that when you were not even 30. But it still reads so. When I read this book and that book, I still hear your strong voice. You know. So
thank you. Yes, I wrote that book, Motherless Daughters, when I was 28, 29 years old, but it has been updated twice. So my adult consciousness does, I think, peek through here and there. But yes, I was very young. Yeah, I think of the AfterGrief as Motherless Daughters for grown-ups.
I love that. I love that. I really do. Oh, at least we're ending this conversation on a happy note, on a joke, on a laugh. So thank you so much. I'm extending a big, big hug to you. I will meet you one day.
I got you, Anna. Thank you so much for all the work you do.
Can you tell about the retreats? If people want to attend one of your retreats?
Yes, I do them in Los Angeles and Connecticut. And I was about to go international before COVID. So hopefully we'll come back to that. But all the information is at motherlessdaughters.com.
Oh, and when is the next one, the upcoming one?
The next one is at the beginning of April. It's for women who were in their 20s when their mothers died. And then for sure, we're doing another one in October for women who were up to age 21 when their moms died. That one will be in Connecticut. And then we may have some more on the calendar in between.
I may have to attend the Connecticut one. It's right here in my neck of the woods. And I am right in that category.
Well, Anna, I absolutely hope to see you there. It goes from a Thursday at evening until Sunday afternoon.
And I will get to have a chance to meet you in person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hope. I really love you. But take care.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. I treasured this time with Hope. It was meaningful and very special. What is your biggest takeaway? As I said in the introduction, the AfterGrief, her new book, Finding Your Way Along the Long Arc of Loss, is an excellent resource, and I hope you'll get a copy either for yourself or for someone who really needs it. I love hearing from you. How are you enjoying the podcast? What are some of your recent favorite episodes, topics, guests? I welcome your feedback, comments, and of course, questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact. If you love the podcast and enjoy the content, there are several ways you can show your support. Number one, you can rate, or better yet, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. You can rate the show on Spotify if you happen to listen on Spotify. And of course, you can become a patron on patreon.com. With a small monthly contribution, you can support your favorite show and get supporter-only benefits, content, and exclusive access to me. To learn more and choose a level of support, go to patreon.com/authentic parenting. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and elsewhere. And you can connect with me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use. Until next week, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.